President, I rise this afternoon to discuss the Presidential Tax Transparency Act, legislation that I have authored with Senators Warren, Bennett, Kaine, Baldwin, and Boxer. And the reason I proposed this legislation, Mr. President, is that ever since Watergate, it has been routine for Democratic and Republican presidential nominees to release their tax returns. So in effect, this has been the norm. This has been the standard operating procedure for almost 4 decades. That's because the American people expect transparency when it comes to a presidential candidate's actions and values. They, of course, are running for the highest office in our land. They're running to be commander-in-chief of the most powerful nation in the history of the world. And when transparency is the overwhelming expectation of the American people regarding the presidency, my view is it ought to be the law. Right now, we are in the midst of a presidential election. The nominating conventions are just weeks away. And one of the candidates, who has become his party's presumptive nominee, has thus far refused to release his tax returns. This, in my view, is a clean break from decades of traditions in our elections. In my view, it is a rebuke of the overwhelming majority of Americans. Polls indicate a majority of Republicans who demand, as has been the case, as I've indicated, for decade after decade, the people have demanded openness and honesty from their presidential candidates of both political parties on this issue. The reason is the tax returns give the American people a lot of straightforward, honest answers. It's not just about what rate you pay. It's about, do you even pay taxes? Do you give to charity? Are you abusing loopholes at the expense of hardworking middle-class families? Do you keep your money offshore? The fact is, the tax return shines a light on your financial integrity. They'll show if a person is trying to game the system, for example, by having their company pay for personal vacations on a private jet. Certainly that is something far removed from the reaches of most hardworking families. My view has been, Mr. President, that running for president is pretty much like a job interview. Every candidate has to stand up before the public and show that they have the temperament, the background, and the character to lead our wonderful country and be commander-in-chief. I believe that after decades of tradition, releasing tax returns is a big part of the process. When it comes to a candidate's financial background in taxes, I don't think the public should have to just take somebody's word for it or just accept the kind of boasting that you see on some of these shows that get wide viewership. The public's got a right to know the facts, and the public's got a right to know the truth. So the proposal that my colleagues and I have proposed, my colleagues here in the Senate, is pretty simple. It says that within 15 days of becoming the nominee at the party conventions, the candidates would be required to release at least 3 years of tax returns. If a nominee stonewalls the law and refuses, then the Treasury Secretary would share the returns with the Federal Election Commission, and that commission would make them public online, and there would be an opportunity as well for redactions, what in effect are changes when appropriate. When presidents nominate individuals for cabinet seats and executive branch jobs within the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, Mr. President, the Treasury Secretary, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Social Security, for example, when you have a nominee, those nominees all submit 3 years of tax returns for the committee to review. When there's a need and where it's appropriate, information from those returns is made public. Now remember, that's the standard, Mr. President, for people who would serve under the President of the United States. In my view, the Commander-in-Chief ought to be required to do better. And the fact is, nominees have traditionally released a lot more than 3 years, so probably it's a bit modest, and a number of people who've looked at the proposal support what I and our colleagues are doing, like the transparency, like the disclosure, and a number of them have said you really ought to think about going further. Now, I want to emphasize again, and I think colleagues know that I've probably spent as much time here in the Senate as any colleague trying to promote ideas and policies and get beyond just kind of some of the partisanship that dominates these debates. I'm talking about candidates on both sides being required to meet this new bar. The same rules would apply to all nominees from both parties. And a word, Mr. President, about this notion of requiring a presidential nominee to do this. I certainly wish that it wasn't necessary to have a law requiring this. That would be my first choice. And the fact is, it shouldn't take a law because this has been the norm. This has been the expectation. Now, here's how I came to believe that a law was necessary. You volunteer to run for president of our wonderful country. You're not required to do it. You volunteer to do it. When you volunteer, in my view, there has been this norm. There has been this expectation since Watergate, almost 40 years. There's been this expectation that you would make public your tax return. So the failure to do so really deviates from the norm, deviates away from transparency and in favor of secrecy. So my view is, when a candidate for President of the United States is not willing to disclose their taxes, do it voluntarily, and deviates from the norm, deviates from the expectation, the understandable expectation that the American people have, then I think you need a law, and that's why I have proposed it. For these 40 decades, the American people have been pretty clear. If you're a major party's nominee to be the leader of the free world, you do not get to hide your tax returns. So I hope my colleagues, this is the first time I've discussed our proposal here on the floor, I hope our colleagues will support the Presidential Tax Transparency Act, and I hope that our colleagues on both sides of the aisle will agree that the American people deserve this guarantee of tax transparency that I have described this afternoon.